Hello, this is Meet the Writers. I'm Georgina Godwin. My guest today is a Scottish novelist and essayist who's written 7 novels, 3 of which have been nominated for the Booker Prize, including the shortlisted debut novel Our Fathers in 1999. He's since won the Los Angeles Times Book Award and the E.M. Forster Award, amongst others. His books have been adapted for stage and screen, including the non-fiction book The Missing, part reportage, part memoir, which became a BAFTA award-winning TV series, and novels Be Near Me and Mayflies, which were adapted for productions at the Donmar Warehouse and BBC One, respectively. He's an editor-at-large at the London Review of Books, where he's written about his experience as Julian Assange's ghostwriter. He's a contributor to Esquire, the New York Review of Books and the New Yorker. He's a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, and last month he was appointed as Honorary Professor at the University of Glasgow. Andrew O'Hagan, it's such a pleasure to have you in the studio.
Great to be here, Georgina.
Your book, Caledonian Road, has stormed the charts. It's #1, it's a bestseller.
It's been the most incredible experience. You know, you work hard on these things, in this case, for 10 years, and you think it's a sort of dirty secret that you're keeping, you know, and you're not sure if you might be the only person actually in existence who enjoys this stuff. So it's a great pleasure when you're freed from that notion and you see that other people are taking it up.
Absolutely. And now on this programme, we like to look at the life of the writer as well as the book. But in this case, it would seem to me that the background of your main protagonist, Campbell Flynn, and yours very, very similar.
They are pretty similar. It's one of the sort of privileges, I think, as an experienced novelist, is that you know where to draw the lines both close to yourself and at a distance. And in this case, I felt that Campbell Flynn's situation in life as a Scot living in London for some decades in North London, in his case, an art historian, a man who appears to have everything. He lives in one of those big wedding cake houses in North London, which have become so valuable over recent decades. He's married to a brilliant and interesting and beautiful woman, a therapist, Elizabeth. He has 2 children, a model and a DJ, both of whom are storming through the world, having a great time. And he should be utterly happy, content and settled at 52. But here's the news. Something is wrong with him. There's something off in his life, in his mind, in his sense of who he is, where he's been, his past. He's just falling apart very slowly, and the book really takes him up at that point. And we go all the way into his life as a way of finding out how it is that he got to be in this condition. What is wrong? The drama in that, for me, it felt both local and distant. I mean, Campbell is in trouble in ways that, fortunately, so far, I haven't been. But I could imagine him, a good liberal, a man who thought he was on, quote, the right side of history, a man who not only read The Guardian but wrote for it, who thought of himself as somebody who had been there supporting the right causes all his life. But has he been? To what extent is there self-delusion involved in the life of a good liberal man like Campbell Flynn?
And a good liberal man like Andrew O'Hagan. Let's go back to your childhood, your Glasgow childhood, which was really quite complicated. Your parents were chaotic.
Definitely. I think it's only right to, if you're asking people to confront honesty in your books, that you, so far as you can be, are honest about the journey you've made. And in my childhood, working class housing estate outside Glasgow on the Ayrshire coast. My parents were chaotic. They were also, I think, ill-prepared for having 4 boys and all the responsibilities that went with it. In some ways, I think the thing I certainly have in common with my brothers, is that we lived in a situation where everything was slightly reversed, and we were the parents and our parents were the children. They certainly behaved that way, and it took a long time for us to sort of get used to the idea that we had been largely unparented in our childhoods. My mum did her best. She worked quite hard. She tried to provide for us, but I think emotionally and psychologically, my parents were never parents. They were always needy. They were always, to some extent, narcissistic, and the 4 boys had to sort of gather their forces and invent a way of taking responsibility in that house.
How did you cope? Was there something that helped you through that?
Each other. I think I've always had trouble imagining what it must be like to have no siblings, no support system. I would always look to my elder brothers. I was the youngest of 4. And it would sometimes be them that were getting us ready for school in the morning. My mum worked night shift at one point, and all the children were in the house alone. And the eldest at that point was 10, and I was the youngest at possibly 3, 2. And getting ready for school, organising some sort of breakfast. The word homework was never mentioned in our house. It was that kind of house. I mean, chaos of a particular sort where I was always looking to my brothers to sort of give me some sort of guidance. So we made it through, and there were neighbours. I mean, it's a thing that's largely disappeared from communities, at least disappeared in the form that it used to exist. That my neighbours were like the mothers who lived next door and in the square where I grew up were like aunties. You know, they would clip your ear if you were doing something wrong, and they would give you breakfast if you were hungry, and they would pick you up from school. And, you know, there was a sense of neighbours in my childhood outside Glasgow. We'd always be looked out for, even if our parents weren't there.
And how did you get away? How did you then go ahead and forge this wonderful career as a journalist and an author?
The local library. You know, I'm upset to discover that more and more libraries are closing in this country. And I feel it very personally. You know, some issues you can be a bit abstract about or a bit academic, but I'm not academic about the idea of closing libraries. I had word yesterday there's a move to close school libraries in North Ayrshire, which is exactly where I grew up. That library wasn't just a repository of books. It was a safe space within a rowdy school in the middle of an estate. You know, it was a place where you could go to calm down, a place where you could go to speak to an adult, not about lessons, a place where you could pick up a book, certainly, read a magazine, put your head on your arms and go for a snooze. I mean, it was a safe spot, and I'm just so upset at the idea that future generations of young people don't have that. It certainly saved me. There were no books in our house growing up. There were no safe spaces as I'm describing them. There was nowhere to be quiet in a big rowdy council house. And I think that we have a responsibility, almost as a matter of national health, well-being, civic freedom, to provide those spaces, especially for young people, but not only for young people, for elderly people too. I see it in all the communities that I've lived in, how the local library has been just a place out of the rain, of every sort of rain, a place where you can go and read a newspaper that maybe you can't afford to buy. And that is important. And that, I have to say, I know it's off the point of your question, but for me, that was what gave me the gumption, the wherewithal, the experience, and the company. The librarians were my company. They got me into a position where I could prepare for exams, sit exams, get to university. I was saved by a group of mainly, and I say this pointedly, female professional librarians and teachers who saw that I was from quite a struggling household, and they pushed me through the system.
And in fact, we see that in your book. We see that there's this kind of skeleton structure of the book is around these very strong women.
I've always believed that it's a great privilege to have known such powerful and strong women in my life. And I mean that from those earliest days in my life. As I say, my mum did her best. I mean, she was presented with unbelievable challenges, both personally, but also maritally, economically. I mean, she was a school cleaner who also cleaned a chip shop and then did night shift in a factory that sorted cakes into boxes. That was my mum's life whilst having 4 boys and an absent husband. So I really felt that the strength that she displayed must be mentioned next to all the chaos.
Yeah.
But she also had a sister, my Auntie Famie, who was an amazing sort of powerhouse of can-do. As I mentioned before, the female neighbours, then the teachers, many of them young women when I think back. My English teacher who really got me to apply for university and sort of saved my life as far as I'm concerned, Mrs. O'Neill, was probably in her early 20s. I was 16. There wasn't that much of an age gap between us when I think about it. But successively, those women took up the case with kids like me, and those librarians I mentioned, all of them really sort of going beyond their pay grade, going beyond their real tasks to say, that kid is actually a reader. He's taking 5, 6, 7 books a week out of this library and bringing them back read. That kid should not be chucked out of school at 16 to go and work in a local factory. We're going to find a way. And they did. They held the pen in my hand as I filled in the UCA form to get to university, you know.
You talk about the neighbours, and of course Campbell Flynn has the most appalling neighbour. She's not exactly, well, she lives in the basement of his property. She is in fact a sitting tenant. And it's hilarious the way you kind of interrogate the way that the law is used to make mischief, really.
Well, It's one of those almost Dickensian opportunities in a big social novel. It's a comedy of manners, and of course, comedy drives us forward towards these very serious concerns. And that's the big Victorian model that we all learned from. I certainly studied it for decades before attempting this book.
Well, it's very Dickensian, isn't it?
I feel it is. You know, I would admit to that, and all the commentators have said so. Yeah. And I take it as a compliment, because that wonderful tradition in the British novel of somehow using comedy and character to drive a moral entertainment, well, that's what I've tried to do. Mrs. Voiles, the woman you mentioned, the sitting tenant downstairs, I think even in her name she sounds a little Dickensian, you know, Mrs. Voiles, you know, somewhere between, I don't know, vole and something else.
Revolting.
Exactly, it's all there, isn't it? But she is that phenomenon which has never really made it into literature, but is everywhere in big city life, London life particularly, which is the sitting tenant, the protected tenant, rightly, by the way, in my view, protected by the law against the behaviour of corrupt landlords and so on. They have a right to remain in these houses, often very elegant and now ludicrously expensive houses in parts of London that are thought desirable. There will be sometimes an elderly person, usually an elderly person, because of the sitting tenancy going back to the 70s or 80s, and they have the right to remain, but often the conditions under which they remain are not happy. They're hostile. They've been in that basement flat not being done up enough and not being looked after. Renovations are often a problem. And whilst their lives not being improved, they see the enrichment of the people upstairs. Decade by decade, these people have become multi-millionaires under their watch while their little basement flat needs its windows fixing. So therein lies the conditions for great drama. Certainly seriousness, but also comedy. And I saw Mrs. Voiles as a new kind of London character, somebody who'd really suffered from the famous property explosion. We're often hearing about these people who bought their house for £6,000 in 1962 and it's now worth $7 million. Well, that's a truth of modern life in London. It's just a truth. I've been here for 35 years. Believe me, I've witnessed it again and again. And I've always also witnessed out the corner of my eye the sitting tenant who has grown in resentment. And I wanted to put them in the book as well as so many other aspects of modern life so that the reader had this sense of a compendium of modern types in the big city.
And you really do. I mean, there is such a wide variety of characters. And I'm really interested to know how you went about researching each of them, because they are so different. And many of them, I imagine, miles away from your own life.
It was huge research. I mean, it was, on a good day I'd call it valiant research, and a less good day, which is most days, I'd call it foolish. There was a lot of costume changes involved in researching this book. You know, I was hanging out with street gangs one day, and then later that day I'd be in the Old Bailey, and then that evening I'd be with oligarchs or dealing with members of the aristocracy. I went to the polo trials at Windsor, was in the company of quite a number of royals, including the Queen at one point, at a particular lunch in the royal enclosure. I've always been good at sort of slipping under the net, quite compact Glaswegian. I can sort of get through small gaps and managed to be at this lunch. And it was absolute gold, as the American writer Joan Didion said of material. Sometimes it's just gold. Yes, full of contradictions. Yes, hints of corruption, power corruption and lies on every side. Relationships between minor royals and Russian money being particularly offensive to my ear and eye. But I chased it down the rabbit hole, and I dived into the rabbit hole and went down and down and down. The research became not just voluminous, but sort of otherworldly. I couldn't believe that whole streets, it seemed to me, of posh houses in Kensington, I happened to know were owned by Russians using corrupt money from foreign accounts. Undeclared money was very easy to launder in London during the last couple of decades when we've been walking around, going about our business. These flats, you can look up at a block of flats in Kensington in February, as I did, and notice that although it's a cold evening and although it's 7:30 and people should be having their supper, every single flat was dark. And that's because they were empty. Mm-hmm. That's what happened. We became a kind of latter-day Casablanca in London over these decades, where it was a very good place to park some dodgy money. And I'm afraid successive governments in this country allowed that to be easy. And we're paying the price for it now.
And you really unpick all that in the book so well. How did the gangs take to you?
Very difficult getting to know a bunch of young boys when you're a middle-aged white guy coming up, even with your zipper on, and you sort of mush up your hair a bit. But they immediately spot somebody like me coming down the road and think, oh, here comes the drug squad. And there was quite a lot of comedy in that, because I can be conscious as I am, I suppose, somewhere in my head always, that I come from a housing estate in Scotland. I know what it's like to be in a working class school, in a working class community, but that doesn't help you when you're 55 and you've been in London for 3 decades and you're trying to approach a bunch of lads who have no reason to trust you and no interest in trusting you either. They've nothing to gain from you. By the by, that's not the same with, as it were, minor royals or oligarchs. They always have an interest in being remembered, being recorded. They like journalists. They say they don't, but they rush towards a notepad, all of them. They like a microphone. You might have experienced this in your career, that they have something to sell, if only their reputation. Mm-hmm. And I found that to be a much easier task, to get close to them. Young guys in street gangs, not so much. They really took a lot of work. And I would encounter them where I could and got to know particular cases. And in one case in particular, I was able to follow a very unfortunate incident involving some of them all the way through to a trial at the Old Bailey. And a lot of the details that I gleaned on their lives came from watching their lives, but also hearing the evidence in the trial. Mm. So I was in the Old Bailey for months and months, but I knew the people who were on trial in a knife crime. So that kind of work, you need to get up early in the morning. For that kind of work. But
I mean, it really shows when you're describing a guy who has just knifed somebody, or at least been on the periphery of the attack, that his thought process, I mean, we're there with him. We feel his absolute agony. It's extraordinary. And yet there are moments of wonderful levity in this book. It's very funny.
I'm really glad you say that, because what I think I wanted more than anything was a big entertainment. I wanted people to enjoy themselves reading this book, to turn the pages with anticipation. And it's not a given, and it's technically a tall order. It's always hard to write an original book, of course, but one that has that kind of propulsion. Oh, that really interested me this time round. I really wanted to give people that experience. The variety of characters was a big part of that for me. There are important things to be done, I think, in the novel form still in this country, and a lot of it's to do with describing or capturing under-described lives. Lives that are very much happening as we speak, but they don't make it into novels. I think people want those imagined lives to be part of what they experience when they read a novel now.
Flynn obviously has a problem, as you say, that something's not right. But the book is really telling us that there's something not right with the state of our nation.
I think so. I mean, we've talked a little today about the business of people laundering their dirty money in London. That's only one aspect of the many things that are wrong with the state of the nation. People often use that phrase, and I'm conscious of it. There is a nation to be described. We have a state at the moment that is different from how it's ever been, even in the Victorian era, when Charles Booth made his famous poverty maps of central London, and he came up with a colour coding for certain streets and roads according to their socio-economic position. I took that map and laid it over Caledonian Road today, and all the side streets and the squares, and it's exactly the same. The colour coding is exactly the same as it was in 1890. Think about that. For by there being an NHS, a consciousness of inequalities, a welfare system, feminism, the pill, you can name it. All that's happened in that period between Charles Booth's poverty maps and today, yet nothing has changed in terms of inequality. The same streets that were poor in 1890 are poor today, and the squares that were rich and full of people doing well and having servants are the same today. Now, we must ask ourselves, if we're interested in really living in the nation that we live in, why that is, what it means. And funnily enough, newspapers, commentators, editorialists can tell us about that, broadcasters, of course, but so can novelists if they take it on.
Which you have done. I mean, one of the characters that I love, simply because he points to the celebrity culture, is the DJ's son. And again, you seem to, I mean, I wouldn't be at all surprised if you tell me now that you went to Ibiza for the summer and hung out in the big
Funny
clubs.
you should say that. Do you know, one of the amazing things, Georgina, about working on a book like this is the stuff you edit out. And I had to throw away quite a lot because the book was long enough, and I had to be very precise and careful that everything that remained was essential. Because albeit a big book, it has to be essential. You have to be turning the pages, gasping to hear what's going to happen to all these 60 characters and their various lives. And so it meant that my trip to Ibiza, for there was one, more than one, all in the name of research, you understand. The glow sticks and everything were all on expenses. And I have to say, there was some funny opportunities going behind the DJs into the VIP areas and clubs and so on, which is something I've done. The notes from that were useful, but in the end those scenes didn't really earn a place and I had to let them go. But sad for me, but I don't know, off-cut someday, the director's cut.
But you did take us into, what's the ship called? The Queen of the Seas?
It's called the Globe. It is one of those ships which has timeshares, basically. It's flats rented by the super rich, or leased, I suppose, by the super rich. And this ship goes round the world like a little bubble. No matter what's happening on the east coast of Africa or in the cities of America or at the South Pole, it just floats past this little bubble full of champagne and excellent wine list and amazing food and well-decorated rooms. And rich people get to be on holiday permanently from what's happening in the world. And I thought, as a novelist, oh my God, I need to put one of my characters onto that ship. And I went there and I made a trip, again, all in the name of research. I mean, you'll be saying to yourself by now, this is the jammiest research experience in history, but I have to admit it was. Sometimes I was on this ship as it went from Venice to Trieste, and I was there overnight, and I managed to cram my notebooks full of detail, and it's all in the novel.
I know, it works brilliantly. Of course, the other central part of this is the young idealist who wants to change the world.
Milo Mangasha. Yes, a student of our principal character, Campbell Flynn, and one of those students who's just all there. He's all 2021 when the novel begins. He knows what he's about. He's not having it anymore. He will question everything that's in front of him. He's a rather brilliant ethical hacker. He's a deconstructor. He's a disruptor. He won't have the old lies, the old ethos, the old language. When he's standing in front of a man like Campbell Flynn, Campbell using words like civilization and experience and freedom, he just peels those words apart. And the reader gets to watch how committed young Milo is when it comes to disrupting the old ways, even the old ways of a liberal. This man's on Milo's side. He's, as I said before, he's a good-thinking liberal man who wants to pursue freedom and equality and so on. But does he really? That's Milo's question. What have you given up for equality in your big house and your privilege and your happy children and your second house? What are you exactly giving up for other people who live on the other side of Caledonian Road? And that's a legitimate question which I'm afraid all of us, including the person speaking right now, have to ask. Our time on planet Earth is pretty limited. So in this great comedy of manners, when we're congratulating ourselves on our stable, good liberal views, what are we actually doing? Are we actually making a difference? Because I think now we've got to a point in British society and in world society where we just can't stand by the old prejudices anymore, including the prejudices of goodness. Thinking you're a good person is a luxury that some people can afford too easily.
We've tried to be good liberals and we failed.
I think we probably have. I was born in 1968. On the very day I was born, in May 25th, the headline in the Times was about how a new world was being born out of the student riots in Paris. This new world of not standing for it anymore, the ingrained prejudices, the terrifying disequilibrium, the attitude towards women. We came in through the 70s and 80s thinking, yes, we're going to be part of the generation that pick up the cudgels permanently, oppose all this and change society for good. Did we?
And I mean, tech should have made a difference. And in this book, tech is something that you really go into a lot. And it really hasn't. It's perhaps just given us another way to hide, as in fact Campbell Flynn does with his hilarious self-help book.
Yes, I mean, one of the things that I think reveals Campbell to be on the slippery slope is that, I mean, he's, despite being rather well off and well heeled, he wants more money. and he's rather jealous of his children for the great fees they're able to command in their entertaining worlds. And so he decides to write a self-help book called Why Men Weep in Their Cars. And there begins a slide. This serious academic, this rather brilliant man writing a silly book that appeals to people in their leisured time. I mean, I wanted to show through comedy that we are in a bit of a crisis politically at the moment, that we can congratulate ourselves on having the right answers, but do we actually put ourselves to the test? I think the next generation are forcing us to consider this. I mean, I say that as a parent. I have a 20-year-old. The 20-year-olds of the world aren't having it the way that we might have done. They simply will peel back even the self-congratulatory, right-on view of people like me and say, no, but in order for the world really to change, we don't need to identify the right-wing people who are doing the dirty. We need to look at how people right across the spectrum are rather complacent. And technology is allowing them to do that, because from a box bedroom in Pittsburgh or in Vladivostok or in Dundee, you can be deconstructing power. I'm not advocating it. I'm saying it's happening. It's happening to banks. It's happening to institutions. We're being held to account now. Cryptocurrency is a way of holding capital to account. Now, I'm interested in that. I think the world has to be interested in that, because at the flick of a few dashes across a keyboard by an experienced young person can disrupt the flow of our lives in all sorts of ways. So the novel has room for that. The novel of the state of the nation certainly should be addressing in what ways protest is changing, because you and I would think of protest in a particular way through the ballot box or demonstrations or sit-downs, but what if technology itself becomes a huge ongoing tool for protest?
Which brings me to another work that you've done, which is, of course, ghostwriting for Julian Assange.
Yes.
That sounds like quite a traumatic experience.
It wasn't the sunniest period of my life. It was very instructive, though. And I think this book benefited quite a lot from that sense of being in among disruptors who might have lacked other skills, social ones, or perhaps
hygienic ones.
Yeah, there was a bit of that too. And I was kind of recovering from that experience with Assange when I started this book 10 years ago. I had a sort of hangover from the whole ethical problem of having a very good cause, trying to hold power to account and speak truth to power as journalists. And WikiLeaks is certainly doing that when I first encountered them. And putting in the middle of that a complex character. A character where perhaps narcissism and self-involvement occluded the work. And I tried to write about that as honestly as I could at the time. But the more lasting effect of it was that it gave me a hunger for finding out about the relationship between technology, ethics, and change in a way that really shaped the novel. You know, that in the end, the people in this novel are dealing every day with the new world that's being revealed to us through the internet. We can't turn back from the internet now. It's there with us. It's almost it's a kind of global consciousness that we have to consort with all day, every day.
This book covers all the big themes. I mean, you've got knife crime, you've got sweatshops, and I found that particularly interesting. Again, I'm quite sure you must have visited.
That was a big part of research that involved me going to Leicester. I had discovered, as might be familiar to you, that some of the biggest numbers of deaths during COVID was among Bangladeshi women who continued to work in sweatshops. Passing garments to each other without proper protection caused great numbers of those women, a whole wave, to contract the disease and to die. And as soon as I found that out, I went to Leicester, found factories, got to know as much as I could about the lives of these Bangladeshi workers and put it into the novel. I wanted it to be part of the truth that I was trying to uncover about the nation, that we had this. They were working for terribly low wages in circumstances where they were really unprotected. And again, this is all happening under the umbrella of a welfare state. I remind listeners, that's what struck me again and again, was that we were supposed to be in this brand new shining society, light years away from the Victorian, Dickensian workhouse environment. But here we are again. Workhouses in Leicester in 2020, full of women who were exposed to great danger. So we're never as far from the past as we think we are.
As I say, Sweatshops are in there, migration, political mendacity, sexual abuse. The pandemic is there. It's dealt with beautifully, I felt. But the whole book comes across, I think, also as a reflection of you. And it's charming, it's witty, it's funny, but it also wants to change the world. And I think that you're off to a jolly good start. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Georgina. It's been such a pleasure.
Caledonian Road is by Andrew O'Hagan. It's published by Faber and Faber, and it's out now. You've been listening to Meet the Writers, thanks to the producer Tamsin Howard and to Mariella Bevan. You can download this show and previous episodes from our website or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.